17 years ago, a young librarian in rural Maryland disappeared while driving home on a rainy night, vanishing without a trace and leaving her family devastated. Police investigated every angle from accident to foul play, but with no body and limited evidence, the case went cold, becoming just another file in an overcrowded system. For years, her husband and daughter refused to give up hope, believing someday they would learn what happened to their beloved wife and mother. Then a shocking discovery by chance changed everything, revealing a truth no one could have imagined, especially about who was responsible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On a stormy October evening in 2004, the small town of Oakridge, Maryland, was drenched in relentless rain. Sarah Mitchell, 35, had just finished her evening shift at the Oakridge Public Library, where she'd worked as head librarian for nearly a decade. As the clock struck 9, she gathered her belongings, said goodbye to her colleague Diane, and hurried through the downpour to her silver Honda Accord, waiting in the dimly lit parking lot. "Drive safe, Sarah," Diane called after her, watching through the window as Sarah's silhouette disappeared into the sheets of rain. "See you tomorrow." But tomorrow never came for Sarah Mitchell. That rainy night would be the last time anyone saw her alive. At home, her husband Thomas waited with their 10-year-old daughter Emma. He'd prepared a simple dinner, keeping it warm in the oven as the clock ticked past 9:30. Then Tenzai, Thomas called Sarah's phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. His concern grew to worry, then panic. By midnight, with the storm still raging outside and no word from his wife, Thomas called the police. His voice trembled as he reported her missing. "She always calls if she's running late, always. Something's wrong." The officer took down the details, promised to send a patrol car to check the route between the library and their home, but reminded Thomas that adults could choose to leave, and 24 hours hadn't yet passed. But Thomas knew Sarah would never willingly leave Emma, never. That night, Oakridge police sent a patrol car to drive the winding back roads Sarah typically took home, a scenic route through dense woodland that local residents preferred to the highway. With visibility severely limited by the storm, officers found nothing unusual. No skid marks, no damaged guardrails, no sign of a vehicle leaving the road. By morning, when Sarah still hadn't returned, the police formally opened a missing person investigation. Detective James Carter, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen too much tragedy, took the lead. He arrived at the Mitchell home early, notepad in hand, face grim but compassionate. "Tell me everything," he said to Thomas as Emma peered around the doorway, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Thomas described Sarah's routine, her personality, their relationship. Happily married for 12 years, no recent arguments, no financial troubles, no signs of depression. Sarah loved her job at the library, adored their daughter, and was planning Emma's birthday party for the following weekend. She had been excited about a new historical fiction collection the library was acquiring. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was planning to disappear. "She wouldn't leave us," Thomas insisted, his knuckles white as he gripped his coffee mug. "She wouldn't." Detective Carter nodded. "I believe you," he said quietly. And he did. After 20 years on the force, Carter had developed an instinct. This wasn't a voluntary disappearance. Something had happened to Sarah Mitchell on that rainy night. The search began immediately. Officers combed the 5-mile stretch between the library and the Mitchell home, focusing on the wooded areas where the road curved sharply near Blackwater Creek. The rain had finally stopped, but it had washed away potential evidence, making the search more difficult. Meanwhile, Thomas refused to sit idle. He printed hundreds of flyers with Sarah's photo, description, and contact information. Her warm smile and kind eyes looked out from papers that Thomas, Emma, and a growing group of concerned neighbors posted throughout Oakridge and neighboring towns. The community rallied quickly. Oakridge was small enough that most people knew Sarah, either from the library or from her volunteer work with the Historical Society. Volunteers formed search parties, trudging through muddy woodland and along the creek banks. The local church opened its doors for a prayer vigil, and meals appeared regularly on the Mitchells' doorstep as the days stretched into weeks. Emma, confused and heartbroken, kept asking when her mother would come home. Thomas would hold her close, telling her that everyone was looking for Mommy, that they had to be brave together. At night, he would sit alone in the kitchen, studying maps of the area, trying to think of places the police might have missed, places where Sarah's car could have gone off the road unnoticed. The local newspaper, the Oakridge Chronicle, ran front-page stories about the disappearance. Sarah's photo appeared on regional news stations. Tips came in. Someone thought they'd seen a silver Honda in the next county. Another reported seeing a woman matching Sarah's description at a gas station near the state line. Detective Carter and his team followed every lead, but each one led nowhere. As weeks turned to months, the intensity of the search diminished. The police maintained that the case remained open, but with no new leads and limited resources, active investigation slowed. The media moved on to other stories. Search parties dwindled to just a few dedicated friends. Thomas fought against the fading attention. He continued to distribute flyers, contacted missing persons organizations, and created a website dedicated to finding Sarah. He would not let his wife become just another statistic, another unsolved case. Emma struggled at school. Once outgoing and academically gifted, she became withdrawn. Her teachers reported that she spent recess alone, often drawing pictures of her mother or writing her letters. Thomas enrolled her in counseling, but nothing seemed to ease the child's pain. How could it, when her world had been torn apart without explanation? Detective Carter continued to check in with Thomas, stopping by the house every few weeks. He had developed a soft spot for the family, particularly for Emma. Sometimes he would bring her books from the library where her mother had worked, telling her that Sarah would want her to keep reading. "We haven't given up," Carter would assure Thomas. Cases like this can break open years later with just one new piece of information. Thomas appreciated the detective's dedication, but as months turned to years, hope began to feel like a burden too heavy to bear. Still, he could not let go. Not when Emma still slept with her mother's cardigan. Not when he still reached for Sarah in the middle of the night, only to find cold emptiness beside him. By 2007, 3 years after Sarah's disappearance, the case had officially gone cold. The file sat in Detective Carter's cabinet, periodically reviewed, but yielding no new insights. Carter, now nearing retirement, considered it his greatest professional disappointment. He had promised the Mitchell family answers, and he had failed to deliver. Thomas maintained Sarah's side of the closet untouched, her clothes hanging neatly, her favorite perfume still sitting on the dresser. He kept her library card in his wallet. Emma, now 13, had created a memory box where she kept treasures that reminded her of her mother, ticket stubs from movies they'd seen together, the bookmark Sarah had been using in her last novel, a mother-daughter photo from their final summer vacation. Life continued in a strange limbo. Thomas eventually returned to his job as a high school science teacher. Emma grew taller, her features gradually resembling her mother's. They established new routines, found moments of joy despite the cloud of uncertainty that hung over their lives. But the question remained, haunting their quiet moments. What happened to Sarah? The 4th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance arrived with the same October rain that had fallen the night she vanished. Thomas and Emma visited the library, now with a reading corner dedicated to Sarah's memory. They placed fresh flowers beside her photograph, a tradition they maintained each year. Diane, Sarah's colleague who had been the last to see her, hugged them both. "I still expect to see her walk through that door," she admitted, her eyes glistening with tears. "I still save articles I know she'd want to read." That evening, Thomas and Emma sat at their kitchen table, a single candle burning between them. They shared memories of Sarah, her laugh, the way she sang off-key in the car, how she always remembered the plots of books she'd read years ago. "Do you think we'll ever know what happened to her?" Emma asked, her voice small but steady. Thomas reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise you we'll never stop looking." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the years passed, Oakridge changed. The library expanded with a new wing. Downtown added trendy cafes, catering to tourists visiting nearby Chesapeake Bay. Detective Carter retired, passing Sarah's case file to younger officers who reviewed it periodically, but had no personal connection to the family or the investigation. Homas dated occasionally at the urging of friends who worried about his isolation, but these relationships never progressed. How could they, when his heart remained tethered to a ghost? Emma graduated high school and left for college, choosing to study library science in honor of her mother. The Mitchell house grew quieter, the spaces between Thomas's footsteps filled with memories and unanswered questions. Then, in the summer of 2021, 17 years after Sarah's disappearance, an unexpected phone call changed everything. Thomas was grading final exams when his cell phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Layla Washington, who had taken over Oakridge's cold cases after Carter's retirement. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice measured but with an unmistakable undercurrent of excitement. "We found a car in Blackwater Reservoir, a silver Honda Accord. The license plate matches your wife's vehicle." Thomas sat down hard, the phone trembling in his hand. After 17 years, the reservoir had been partially drained for dam repairs, revealing what the water had hidden for nearly 2 decades. "I'm coming down there," he said, already reaching for his keys. The scene at Blackwater Reservoir was surreal. Police vehicles lined the shore. Yellow tape cordoned off the area where a crane was slowly lifting the mud-covered vehicle from the water. Thomas stood behind the police line, his heart pounding as the car emerged, water cascading from its rusted frame. Detective Washington approached him, her expression somber. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to prepare you. We found human remains inside the vehicle." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Part of him had always known this day would come. Another part had desperately hoped for a different outcome, that somehow, somewhere, Sarah was still alive. The car was transported to a secure facility for forensic examination. The remains would require DNA testing for official identification. But the wedding ring found inside the vehicle, a unique design with 3 small sapphires that Thomas had special ordered for their 10th anniversary, left little doubt. Thomas called Emma at her apartment in Baltimore. She answered sleepily. It was past midnight, but was instantly alert when she heard the tremor in her father's voice. "They found Mom's car," he said simply. There was a long silence before Emma responded, her voice breaking. "Is she?" "Yes, sweetheart. I think so." Emma drove to Oakridge that night, arriving at the family home just before dawn. Father and daughter sat together on the porch swing, where Sarah used to read on summer evenings, holding each other as the sky lightened and birds began to sing. "At least now we know," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "At least she didn't leave us." Thomas nodded, his throat too tight for words. The not knowing had been its own special torture. Now at least they could mourn properly. They could say goodbye. In the days that followed, the forensic team meticulously examined the vehicle. The car had apparently plunged into the reservoir from an unmarked access road that ran along its eastern edge. This area wasn't on Sarah's usual route home, raising immediate questions. Why was she there? What had happened that rainy night? The medical examiner confirmed what everyone had suspected. The remains belonged to Sarah Mitchell. The cause of death appeared to be drowning, but with an unexpected complication, a fracture to the back of the skull, inconsistent with injuries typically sustained in a car accident. Detective Washington presented these findings to Thomas and Emma in the living room of their home, her voice gentle but professional. "Mr. Mitchell, Miss Mitchell, I need to be direct with you. We're treating your wife's death as suspicious. The injury to her skull suggests she may have been struck before the car entered the water." Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thomas sat perfectly still, absorbing the information like a physical blow. "Are you saying someone killed her?" he asked finally, his voice hollow. "We're saying it's a possibility we need to investigate," Washington replied carefully. The location where the car was found isn't on any route she would normally take home. And the injury. She paused. Well, it raises questions. The revelation transformed their grief. For 17 years, they had imagined an accident. Sarah's car sliding off the road in the storm, impossible to find in the vast reservoir. The possibility that someone had deliberately hurt her, had taken her from them intentionally, ignited a new kind of pain, a searing anger that burned alongside their sorrow. Who would want to hurt her? Emma asked, her voice small. Everyone loved Mom. It was the question that now drove the investigation. Detective Washington reopened the case fully, starting from scratch. She interviewed Sarah's colleagues at the library, her friends from the Historical Society, neighbors and acquaintances. She reviewed Sarah's bank records, email accounts, and phone records from 2004, searching for any hint of conflict or trouble. Thomas provided access to everything he had: Sarah's journals, letters, their shared computer. He racked his brain for anything unusual in the weeks before her disappearance. Had she mentioned any strange encounters? Any concerns? But their life had been ordinary, happily so. Sarah had been planning Emma's birthday party, researching garden designs for the following spring, looking forward to a library conference in November. Nothing suggested she had enemies or secrets. Then, during a routine follow-up interview with Diane, Sarah's colleague from the library, a new detail emerged. Diane mentioned that in the months before Sarah disappeared, a patron had become oddly fixated on her. He would always request that Sarah help him, even when other librarians were available. Brought her coffee sometimes. It made her uncomfortable, though she tried to be professional about it. When Detective Washington asked why this hadn't been mentioned during the original investigation, Diane looked embarrassed. I did tell Detective Carter, but the man had an alibi for that night. He was at a work conference in Pittsburgh. They checked and confirmed it. Plus he was. Well, he was respected in town. No one really thought he could be involved. Who was this patron? Washington asked. Diane hesitated before answering. Robert Calloway, the high school principal. Washington froze, her pen hovering above her notepad. Robert Calloway was still the principal at Oakridge High School. He was Thomas Mitchell's boss. The revelation sent the investigation in an unexpected direction. Washington began quietly looking into Robert Calloway's background, his whereabouts in October 2004, and his interactions with Sarah Mitchell. What she discovered was troubling. While Calloway had indeed been registered at a conference in Pittsburgh the night Sarah disappeared, hotel records showed he had checked out a day early. His credit card was used at a gas station just outside Oakridge at 10:17 p.m. on the night Sarah vanished, less than an hour after she left the library. Washington brought this information to her superior, who authorized a deeper investigation into Calloway. They discovered he had a sealed juvenile record from another state, unusual for someone in educational leadership. With a court order, they accessed the file and found a disturbing pattern of stalking behavior toward a female teacher when Calloway was 17. The pieces were starting to form a disturbing picture. Washington theorized that Calloway may have developed an obsession with Sarah, following her on the night of the storm. Perhaps he had tried to approach her, been rejected, and reacted violently. The location of the reservoir suggested he knew the area well. It was near hunting grounds that locals like Calloway frequented. The detective decided it was time to bring Thomas into her confidence. She couldn't risk him unknowingly saying something to Calloway at school, now that the principal was a person of interest. When she revealed her suspicions, Thomas was stunned. Calloway? But he's been supportive all these years. He helped organize fundraisers when Sarah first disappeared. He gives a scholarship in her name every year. Sometimes, Washington said gently, the people who insert themselves into cases, who seem most supportive, are hiding their involvement. The scholarship, the fundraisers, they might be his way of staying close to the case, monitoring the investigation, or even assuaging his guilt. Thomas thought about all the staff meetings, the parent-teacher conferences, the school events where he'd sat across from Calloway, never suspecting that the man might know what happened to Sarah. The possibility made him physically ill. Washington urged caution. We don't have enough for an arrest yet. We're gathering evidence, and we need to move carefully. He's a prominent figure in town, and we need our case to be airtight. For weeks, Thomas lived with this terrible knowledge, seeing Calloway daily at school, maintaining a facade of normalcy while investigators built their case. Emma came home from Baltimore, ostensibly to help go through her mother's belongings now that they could finally lay her to rest, but really to support her father through this new nightmare. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An anonymous tip led police to a storage unit rented under a false name but paid for with Calloway's credit card. Inside, they found Sarah's missing purse, her library badge, and most damning of all, a journal with entries detailing Calloway's obsession with her. The final entry, dated October 14, 2004, 2 days before Sarah disappeared, read, "If I can't have her, no one will." With the storage unit discovery, the case against Robert Calloway solidified. Detective Washington obtained search warrants for his home, office, and vehicles. As officers methodically combed through the principal's perfectly maintained colonial house on Maple Street, the facade of respectability began to crumble. In Calloway's basement, behind a false wall in his wine cellar, they discovered a disturbing shrine. Photos of Sarah Mitchell covered one wall, candid shots taken without her knowledge at the library, at local shops, even in her own garden. Beside these hung newspaper clippings about her disappearance, police reports Calloway had no right to possess, and a map marking the exact location where the car had been submerged. Detective Washington stood in that basement room, her flashlight illuminating the obsession that had remained hidden for 17 years. "This is no longer a missing person case," she told her team quietly. "This is premeditated murder." That evening, as Calloway left a school board meeting, he found Washington waiting beside his car, flanked by uniformed officers. "Robert Calloway," she said formally, "you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell." News of the arrest exploded through Oakridge like wildfire. By morning, everyone from the barista at the coffee shop to the elderly men who gathered at the hardware store was talking about it. Robert Calloway, respected educator, community leader, recipient of the Governor's Award for Excellence in Educational Administration, accused of murdering a librarian 17 years ago. For those who had known Sarah, the shock was particularly profound. The library staff gathered in stunned silence, trying to recall every interaction Calloway had had with Sarah, looking for signs they might have missed. He would bring her coffee, Diane remembered, her voice hollow. Always with 2 sugars, exactly how she liked it. I thought he was just being friendly. How could I have been so blind? For Thomas and Emma, the arrest brought a storm of conflicting emotions. Relief that Sarah's killer might finally face justice mingled with horror at the revelation that Thomas had worked alongside this man for years, never suspecting the terrible truth. "He sat across from me at faculty meetings," Thomas told Emma, his voice breaking. "He shook my hand at your high school graduation. He asked me how I was holding up, all while knowing exactly what happened to your mother." Emma wrapped her arms around her father, her tears soaking his shirt. "You couldn't have known, Dad. None of us could." The day after the arrest, Thomas took a leave of absence from teaching. He couldn't bear to walk the halls of Oakridge High, couldn't face the pitying glances or well-meaning questions from colleagues and students. Instead, he focused on supporting Emma and preparing for what they knew would be a difficult legal battle ahead. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to uncover disturbing details. Forensic analysts extracted DNA from the car that matched Calloway, placing him at the scene. They found microscopic traces of Sarah's blood on an antique paperweight from Calloway's home office, likely the weapon used to strike her before the car entered the water. Most chilling was the recovery of Calloway's personal journal from 2004, hidden in a safe deposit box. The entries revealed a man whose initial admiration for the librarian had twisted into dangerous obsession. "Saw Sarah today," one entry read. "She smiled when I brought her coffee, but then Davidson from the history department came in, and she smiled at him too. She shouldn't smile at other men like that. She doesn't understand what we have. The entries grew increasingly disturbed as weeks passed, culminating in the October 14th entry that investigators had already discovered. If I can't have her, no one will. Detective Washington meticulously built her case, determined to ensure Calloway would never walk free again. She interviewed former students, teachers, and staff members, creating a timeline of Calloway's behavior in the months surrounding Sarah's disappearance. A former secretary revealed that Calloway had been unusually insistent on knowing Sarah's schedule. He would ask when she worked evening shifts, said he needed to coordinate some educational program with the library, but nothing ever came of it. A groundskeeper recalled seeing Calloway's car near the reservoir access road several times in the weeks before Sarah vanished. Thought he might be fishing, though it was odd hours for that. Never saw him with any gear. As these pieces came together, the prosecutor's office prepared for what would be one of the most high-profile trials in county history. District Attorney Eleanor Patel, known for her uncompromising approach to violent crimes, took personal charge of the case. "We will be seeking first-degree murder charges," she announced at a press conference outside the courthouse. "The evidence suggests this was not a crime of passion or opportunity, but a calculated act by someone who had planned it for some time." Calloway's defense team quickly countered with their own statement, claiming their client was innocent and that the evidence was circumstantial. They suggested the shrine was misunderstood, merely the collection of a concerned community member who had taken a personal interest in the case. "Mr. Calloway has been a pillar of this community for decades," his attorney argued. "The idea that he harbored some secret criminal past is absurd and defamatory." But as preliminary hearings began, the defense's position weakened. The juvenile records showed a clear pattern of obsessive behavior. Former colleagues from Calloway's previous school district came forward with accounts of inappropriate fixations on female staff members. And most damning, forensic accountants discovered he had been making regular payments to the storage facility where Sarah's belongings were found, dating back to November 2004, just weeks after her disappearance. Throughout these proceedings, Thomas and Emma attended every hearing, sitting silently in the front row. They wanted Calloway to see them, to know that Sarah had been loved, that she'd been missed every day for 17 years, that she had been more than just an object of his obsession. The community's reaction was complex. Some refused to believe Calloway could be guilty, pointing to his years of service to the school. Others recalled small moments of discomfort, his intensity when contradicted, his particular interest in female staff and parents, the way his friendly demeanor sometimes felt forced. The local newspaper ran a feature examining how predators hide in plain sight, using respectability and community standing as shields. A vigil was held at the library, not just for Sarah now, but for anyone who had ever felt unsafe but unheard. 3 months after Calloway's arrest, as summer heat gave way to autumn chill, the trial began. The courthouse was packed, with a line stretching down the block. National media descended on Oakridge, turning the small town's tragedy into headline news. Day after day, the prosecution built its case. The DNA evidence, the shrine, the journal entries, the storage unit. Witnesses testified about Calloway's unusual interest in Sarah, his knowledge of the reservoir area, his unaccounted hours on the night of her disappearance. Then came the medical examiner's testimony. Dr. Eleanor Chen presented her findings with clinical precision, but her words painted a horrifying picture. The fracture to the occipital bone is consistent with a strong blow from behind with a rounded, heavy object. The injury would have rendered the victim unconscious, but was not immediately fatal. She paused, meeting the eyes of the jury members before continuing. The presence of water in the lungs indicates the victim was still alive when the vehicle entered the water. Death resulted from drowning. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Thomas closed his eyes, his hand gripping Emma's so tightly his knuckles whitened. The implications were unbearable. Sarah had been struck, rendered helpless, and then left to drown as her car sank into the dark waters of the reservoir. The defense fought back, questioning the reliability of DNA evidence after so many years, suggesting alternate theories. Perhaps Sarah had given Calloway a ride at some point, explaining his DNA in her car. Perhaps she had confided in him about personal troubles, explaining his detailed knowledge of her life. They brought in character witnesses, former students, parents, colleagues, who spoke of Calloway's dedication to education and community service. But the prosecution had one final devastating piece of evidence. On the 6th day of trial, they presented a partial fingerprint found on the inside of the car's trunk release latch, preserved because it had been protected from the water. The print matched Calloway's right index finger. Why? Prosecutor Patel asked the jury during closing arguments. Would Robert Calloway's fingerprint be on the inside of Sarah Mitchell's trunk release? There is only one explanation that fits all the evidence. He was in that car the night she died. He struck her from behind, drove her to the reservoir, and sent her car into the water, leaving her to drown alone in the darkness. After 7 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. Thomas, Emma, Detective Washington, and the entire town held their collective breath. Would 17 years be too long? Would the evidence be enough? The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Robert Calloway, guilty. Thomas let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 17 years. Beside him, Emma sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking with relief and grief. Across the aisle, Calloway sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief as officers moved to take him into custody. 2 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, Judge Harriet Moore looked down at Calloway from the bench, her expression severe. "Robert Calloway, you have been found guilty of the murder of Sarah Mitchell. For nearly 2 decades, you walked free while her family suffered the agony of not knowing. You attended their fundraisers, offered them condolences, looked them in the eye, knowing exactly what you had done." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." As Calloway was led away, Thomas stood. After 17 years of uncertainty, after months of revelations and painful truths, he finally had the chance to address his wife's killer directly. "You took Sarah from us," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "You took a mother from her daughter, a wife from her husband, a daughter from her parents, a friend from countless people who loved her. But you never took our memory of her. You never diminished who she was." He gestured to Emma beside him. "Look at her daughter. Look at what Sarah created, the love she left behind. That's her legacy. That's what will endure long after you're forgotten." Calloway kept his head down, refusing to meet Thomas's gaze as he was escorted from the courtroom. Outside, rain fell softly on the courthouse steps. October rain, like the night Sarah disappeared. In the weeks that followed, Oakridge began the difficult process of healing. The school board appointed an interim principal and launched a thorough review of hiring practices and background checks. The library created a memorial garden where Sarah's favorite books were quoted on stone markers along winding paths. For Thomas and Emma, justice brought closure, but could never erase their loss. They could finally lay Sarah to rest properly, with a funeral service attended by hundreds from the community. Her grave was covered with flowers, not just from family and friends, but from library patrons who remembered her kindness, from students whose research she had guided, from a town that had lost one of its own. Detective Washington visited the cemetery a week after the funeral, placing a single white rose on the fresh grave. "We got him, Sarah," she said quietly. "He can't hurt anyone else now." As she turned to leave, she saw Thomas approaching along the path. They nodded to each other in recognition, 2 people connected by tragedy and the long pursuit of truth. "I wanted to thank you," Thomas said, "for not giving up, for finding answers when everyone else had moved on." Washington shook her head. "I just followed the evidence. You and Emma, you kept her memory alive. That's what really mattered." They stood together in silence for a moment before Washington spoke again. The department psychologist talked about closure, about how knowing the truth helps families heal. Does it feel that way to you? Thomas considered the question, looking at the headstone, with Sarah's name finally marking her resting place. Not closure, exactly. I don't think that exists, not really. But knowing feels better than not knowing. Having somewhere to bring flowers feels better than staring at an empty chair. He sighed, watching leaves drift across the cemetery grounds. The hardest part was living with uncertainty, wondering if she was out there somewhere, if she had chosen to leave, if she was suffering. Now we know. Now we can remember her without that shadow hanging over everything. Washington nodded, understanding the complex grief that came with answers too long delayed. "What will you do now?" she asked gently. "Live," Thomas said simply. "Honor her memory by living." Emma's talking about establishing a scholarship in Sarah's name for library science students. "I might go back to teaching eventually, but for now I'm writing a book about Sarah, about who she really was, not just a victim or a headline." As they walked together toward the cemetery gates, Thomas added, "You know what I realized during the trial? Calloway never knew her." Not really. He was obsessed with an image, a fantasy. He never knew how she snorted when she laughed too hard, or how she could never remember where she parked at the mall, or how she stayed up all night with Emma when she had nightmares. He smiled sadly. "That's what I want people to remember. The real Sarah, not how she died, but how she lived." The case of Sarah Mitchell changed Oakridge forever. The town installed security cameras at the library and improved lighting in the parking lot. The police department created a new protocol for missing persons cases, promising more thorough initial investigations. The reservoir access road was gated and monitored. But beyond these practical changes, there was a deeper transformation in how the community understood itself. The myth of small-town safety, of knowing your neighbors completely, had been shattered. In its place grew a more vigilant compassion. People looking out for each other, not just from kindness, but from an awareness that danger could hide behind familiar faces. Detective Washington found herself in demand at law enforcement conferences, sharing how modern forensic techniques could solve decades-old cases. Her presentation always ended with Sarah's library ID photo, not to sensationalize the case, but to remind officers that behind every cold case file was a real person deserving of justice, no matter how much time had passed. Emma graduated with her master's degree in library science that spring. At the ceremony, she wore a bracelet that had belonged to her mother, one of the few personal items recovered from the car that could be restored. She accepted her diploma with tears in her eyes, knowing her mother would have been proud. After graduation, she was offered a position at the Oakridge Public Library, at the same desk where Sarah had once worked. Some thought it might be too painful, but Emma saw it differently. "Mom loved connecting people with knowledge, with stories that could change their lives," she told Thomas. "I can't think of a better way to honor her than doing the same thing." Thomas returned to teaching the following fall, but at a different school in a neighboring town. He couldn't face the classrooms where Calloway had once been his superior. His students knew his story. It was impossible to keep it private after the national media coverage, but they respected his boundaries, never asking directly about the case. Instead, they noticed how he stayed late to help struggling students, how he organized science fairs with special awards for girls interested in STEM, how he kept a photo of a smiling woman on his desk and sometimes spoke to it when he thought no one was watching. 5 years after Calloway's conviction, on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, Thomas and Emma stood together by the reservoir. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and gold of autumn trees. In Emma's hands was a small wooden boat carrying a lit candle. "I used to be afraid of this place," Emma admitted, looking out over the water. "Now it just feels sad?" Thomas nodded. "For a long time, I couldn't drive past here without feeling sick. But someone wise once told me that avoiding the hard places doesn't make them go away." Emma carefully set the little boat on the water's surface, watching as it drifted slowly toward the center of the reservoir. the candle flames steady in the still evening air. "Do you think she knows?" Emma asked softly. "That we found out the truth? That we never gave up?" Thomas put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, seeing Sarah's eyes in her face, Sarah's determination in the set of her jaw. "I think she always knew we wouldn't give up. That's why she fought so hard to leave us clues, her ring, her badge. She knew someday someone would find them and follow the trail back to the truth." They watched in silence as the boat floated farther out, the tiny flame a beacon against the gathering dusk. Other candles appeared along the shoreline as community members arrived for the annual remembrance. Neighbors, library patrons, Sarah's friends, Detective Washington and her team, even retired Detective Carter, who had kept the case open when others would have let it fade away. "Look at all these people," Emma said wonderingly. "All these years later, and they still come to remember her." Thomas smiled, feeling a weight lift from his heart. "That's because your mother wasn't just a case file or a tragedy. She was a light in this community, and real light doesn't just disappear. It changes things permanently, leaves everything it touches a little brighter." As darkness fell completely, the reservoir became a mirror for dozens of candle flames, a constellation of remembrance for a woman who had been lost but never forgotten, whose absence had shaped a family and a town, whose memory had fueled a search for truth that spanned 17 years. The case of Sarah Mitchell would be studied by criminology students for decades to come, an example of how determination, forensic advancement, and simple refusal to give up could solve even the coldest of cases. But for those who had known her, who had loved her, Sarah was far more than a case study or a cautionary tale. She was the librarian who knew exactly which book would capture a reluctant reader's interest. She was the wife who left funny notes in lunchboxes. She was the mother who taught her daughter that stories had power, that knowledge was freedom, that kindness mattered more than being right. And now, finally, she was at rest, her story known, her killer brought to justice, her memory honored by those who carried her light forward into the future she had been denied. 10 years after Robert Calloway's conviction, Oakridge had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The library where Sarah had once worked now featured a reading garden dedicated to her memory, with benches arranged among flowering plants and a small fountain at its center. A bronze plaque bore her name and the simple words, "Knowledge shared is love multiplied." Emma Mitchell, now 37, had become the library's director. She had her mother's warm smile and patient manner, but also a fierce determination that was uniquely her own. Under her leadership, the library had expanded its community programs, creating partnerships with local schools and offering resources for those in need. On a crisp autumn morning, Emma stood in her office arranging books on a shelf. The wall behind her desk displayed her credentials, alongside a restored photograph of Sarah. It had become something of a tradition for new library employees to be introduced to this photo, to understand that they were part of a legacy of service that had survived even the darkest tragedy. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Detective Layla Washington, now with streaks of gray in her dark hair, stood in the doorway. "Got time for coffee?" she asked with a smile. Over the years, Washington had become more than just the officer who solved Sarah's case. She was a friend, a connection to a past that Emma had spent a lifetime processing. They met regularly, sometimes to discuss cold cases Washington was working on, sometimes just to talk about life. At the small cafe across from the library, they settled into their usual corner table. Washington stirred her coffee slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years since the trial," she said. Emma nodded. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like another lifetime." "Your father's book is doing well, I hear." Thomas Mitchell's memoir, Finding Sarah, A Family's Search for Truth, had been published 2 years earlier. Part tribute to his wife, part chronicle of a 17-year journey for answers, it had resonated with readers across the country. Thomas now traveled occasionally, speaking at law enforcement conferences about the importance of cold case investigations and the impact on victims' families. "The publisher just ordered another printing," Emma confirmed. "Dad's a little overwhelmed by all the attention, but I think it helps him to know that Mom's story is making a difference." Washington smiled. "It's made a huge difference in how we approach cold cases. Your father's perspective has been invaluable for training new detectives." Their conversation drifted to other topics. Emma's recent engagement to David, a professor she'd met at a library conference. Washington's upcoming retirement. The changing landscape of Oakridge as new businesses and residents moved in. As they prepared to leave, Washington hesitated, then reached into her bag. "There's actually something I wanted to discuss with you. The reason I stopped by today." She placed a thin file folder on the table. "We received a letter at the department last week. From Calloway." Emma's hand froze halfway to her cup. "What does he want?" "He's dying. Cancer. Terminal, according to the prison medical reports. He's requesting a meeting with you and your father." Emma stared at the folder as if it might bite. Why? After all this time, what could he possibly have to say? "He claims there are things about your mother's case that never came out during the trial. Details he wants to share before he dies." Washington's voice was carefully neutral. "You and your father are under absolutely no obligation to grant this request. No one would blame you for refusing." Emma sat back in her chair, her mind racing. For a decade, she had worked to build a life that honored her mother, while not being defined solely by her absence. She had pursued her career, fallen in love, learned to find joy again. The thought of facing Calloway, of reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal, made her stomach clench. "I need to talk to Dad," she said finally. That evening, Thomas Mitchell sat in his living room, the letter from Calloway spread on the coffee table before him. At 67, his hair was now completely silver, his face lined with the experiences of a life marked by both profound loss and resilient hope. "I don't trust him," Thomas said flatly. "This could be some kind of manipulation. One last power play before he dies." Emma nodded, curled in the armchair across from him. "That's what I thought too. But what if there is something we don't know? Something important about Mom?" They sat in silence, the ticking of the clock on the mantel marking time as they considered the request that had disrupted their carefully reconstructed lives. "If we go," Thomas said finally, "we go together. And Washington comes with us." 3 days later, they made the 2-hour drive to the state penitentiary where Robert Calloway had spent the last decade. The facility was a stark concrete structure surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire. As they followed a guard through security checkpoints and down long, echoing corridors, Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. Calloway waited in a small room, typically used for attorney visits. The man who had once commanded the respect of an entire school system was now gaunt, his prison uniform hanging loosely on his frame. An oxygen tube ran to his nostrils, and his hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. His eyes, however, remained unchanged, the same intense gaze that had unsettled Sarah all those years ago. When he looked up and saw Thomas and Emma, something flickered across his face, recognition perhaps, or the ghost of his former authority. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice raspier than they remembered. Thomas didn't sit. "We're not here for pleasantries, Calloway. You said you have information about Sarah. What is it?" Calloway nodded slowly, gesturing to the chairs across from him. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas and Emma sat down. Washington remained standing by the door, a silent guardian. "I'm dying," Calloway began, touching the oxygen tube. "Lung cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give me weeks, maybe a month." "I'm not here for a medical update," Thomas said coldly. "Say what you need to say." Calloway looked down at his trembling hands. "I've had 10 years to think about what I did, to live with it. I know nothing I say can change the past or bring Sarah back. But there are things you should know, things I never admitted even during the trial." He took a labored breath before continuing. "I was obsessed with Sarah from the first time I saw her at the library. She was everything I thought I wanted, intelligent, graceful, kind. I convinced myself we had a connection, that she felt it too. Emma's hands clenched in her lap as Calloway described how his fixation had grown, how he had invented reasons to visit the library, how he had begun following Sarah, learning her routines. That night, the night of the storm, I saw her leaving the library. I hadn't planned anything. I just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand how I felt. His voice faltered. I followed her in my truck. The rain was coming down so hard. She pulled over. I think she realized someone was following her. When she stopped, I parked behind her and approached her car. Thomas leaned forward, his face rigid with controlled anger. Go on. She recognized me. Rolled down her window just a little. Asked if everything was all right. I started telling her how I felt about her, how we were meant to be together. She was polite at first, then confused, then frightened. She told me she was married, that she loved her husband, that she needed to get home to her family. Calloway's hands wouldn't stop shaking. I lost control. I asked her to get out of the car so we could talk properly. When she refused, when she reached for her phone, I forced my way into the passenger side. We struggled. I had brought a gift for her, a paperweight from my office, a crystal globe. I just wanted her to listen, but she kept trying to get away, to call for help. I hit her with it. I didn't mean to, or maybe I did. I don't know anymore. Emma felt tears sliding down her cheeks as Calloway described what happened next, how he had panicked when Sarah lost consciousness, how he had taken the wheel and driven to the reservoir, a place he knew well from hunting trips, how he had put the car in neutral and pushed it into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface with Sarah still inside. I told myself she was already dead from the blow to her head, that pushing the car into the water wasn't really murder. His voice cracked. But I've had 10 years to face the truth. I knew she might still be alive. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. The room fell silent, except for the rasp of Calloway's breathing. Thomas sat perfectly still, his face ashen. Emma wiped at her tears, trying to process the horror of her mother's final moments. "Why are you telling us this now?" she asked finally. "Why make us live through it again?" Calloway looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "Because there's more. Something I took from the car before I pushed it into the water. Something the police never found." He nodded to Washington, who had been briefed about this claim before the meeting. "I told Detective Washington where to find it. A small metal box buried on my property. Inside is a letter Sarah had written. To you, Emma, for your birthday." Emma's breath caught. Her 10th birthday had been just days after her mother disappeared. "I kept it all these years," Calloway continued. "At first, as some kind of twisted souvenir. Later, I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, but I was too much of a coward to find a way to get it to you." Washington stepped forward. "We recovered the box yesterday, Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Mitchell. The letter is authentic. The handwriting matches samples of Sarah's writing from library records. We've had it tested for fingerprints and DNA. It's being held as evidence, but once processed, it can be released to you." Emma felt lightheaded. After all these years, one last message from her mother, words meant for the child she had been, now to be read by the woman she had become. Thomas stood abruptly. "If that's all, we're done here." Calloway looked up at him pleadingly. "I know you can never forgive me. I don't expect that. But I needed you to know the full truth before I die. That Sarah fought, that she thought of her family even in those last moments. That I've lived with the weight of what I did every day for the past 27 years. Thomas regarded the dying man with a mixture of hatred and pity. "You're right. I can't forgive you, but I'm not going to give you the absolution you're looking for either. Whatever peace you find before you die, you'll have to find it without our help." He turned to Emma. "Let's go." As they walked toward the door, Calloway called after them, his voice strained. "She loved you both so much." She said so at the end. She said, "My family is waiting for me." Those were her last words. Thomas paused at the doorway, not turning around. "No, Calloway, those weren't her last words. Those were her life. Every day she had with us, she showed that love. You didn't take that from us. You couldn't." The drive back to Oakridge was mostly silent, each of them processing what they had heard. Washington had given them a preliminary report about the letter, explaining that it would likely be released to them within a week.
"Are you all right?"
Thomas asked Emma as they neared home, reaching across to squeeze her hand. She nodded slowly. "I think so. It was horrible hearing him describe it. But also what? Also strangely liberating. All these years we've had to imagine what happened. Now we know. As terrible as it is, at least it's not a mystery anymore." Thomas understood. The not knowing had been its own unique torment. Even the most dreadful truth was somehow easier to bear than endless uncertainty. A week later, they sat together in Thomas's living room, a sealed evidence envelope between them. Washington had delivered it personally, then discreetly left them alone. "You should open it," Thomas said gently. "It was meant for you." With trembling fingers, Emma carefully broke the seal and withdrew a birthday card, its once bright colors faded with time. Inside, Sarah's familiar handwriting filled the blank space. "My dearest Emma," she read aloud, her voice catching, "today you are 10 years old, and I can hardly believe how quickly you've grown from my tiny baby into this amazing, curious, kind-hearted girl. Every day with you is a gift I never take for granted." Thomas closed his eyes, hearing Sarah's voice in the words as Emma continued to read. "By the time you're reading this, we'll have celebrated with cake and presents, but I wanted to write something just for you, something you can keep. Something to remind you of how very much I love you, not just on your birthday, but every single day." Emma paused, taking a steadying breath before continuing. "As you grow up, there will be hard times and wonderful times. There will be days when everything makes sense and days when nothing does. Through all of it, remember that you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and loved more than you can imagine." The letter continued with birthday wishes and motherly advice, to follow her dreams, to be kind to others and to herself, to find joy in small moments. It ended with words that brought fresh tears to both their eyes. "Whatever path you choose in life, I will always be proud of you. You are and will always be my greatest happiness. All my love, forever and always, Mom." Emma carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. For several minutes, they sat in silence, the gift of Sarah's words filling the room. "She would be so proud of you," Thomas said finally. "Of the woman you've become, of the life you've built." Emma nodded, wiping away tears. "I've spent so many years trying to piece together memories of her, trying to feel connected to someone I lost when I was so young. And now, reading this, it's like she's speaking directly to me, across all these years." 2 weeks later, they received word that Robert Calloway had died in the prison infirmary. The news brought no joy, but no great sorrow either, just a quiet sense that a long, painful chapter had finally closed. That weekend, Emma and Thomas visited Sarah's grave together, bringing fresh flowers and a copy of the birthday letter, which they had framed. They had decided that the original would be kept safe, but this copy would stay with Sarah. "I used to come here and feel like I was talking to an absence," Emma admitted, as they stood before the headstone. "Now, with her letter, with knowing the whole truth, I feel like I'm finally talking to her." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The Sarah they had grieved for all these years felt more present now, more complete than she had since the night she disappeared. As they walked back through the cemetery, Emma linked her arm through her father's. "I've been thinking about something, about how to honor Mom's memory going forward." "What's that?" "I want to establish a foundation in her name, the Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Cold Case Justice. We could provide resources to help families of missing persons, fund specialized training for detectives, maybe even offer scholarships for students going into forensic science." Thomas smiled, hearing echoes of Sarah's compassion and Emma's determination in the idea. She would love that. Using her story to help others find their answers. "We could work with Detective Washington. She's retiring soon, but she has all that experience, all those connections. And with the proceeds from your book." They spent the drive home outlining their vision, energized by the possibility of transforming decades of pain into something meaningful and hopeful. 6 months later, the Sarah Mitchell Foundation held its inaugural event in the Oakridge Public Library's garden. The weather was perfect. Clear blue skies and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of flowering dogwoods. Chairs had been arranged on the lawn, facing a small podium adorned with a banner bearing the foundation's logo, an open book with a single light shining from its pages. Thomas stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. Emma sat in the front row beside her fiancé David. Detective Washington was there, along with other officers who had worked on Sarah's case over the years. Library staff, community members, representatives from other cold case organizations, all had come to support the launch of this new endeavor. Yet 27 years ago, Thomas began, my wife Sarah left for work one morning and never came home. For 17 of those years, we lived in uncertainty, not knowing what had happened to her. For the past 10 years, we've lived with the painful truth. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But Sarah's story doesn't end with how she was taken from us. It continues in how we choose to honor her memory, in how we help other families still waiting for answers, still living in that terrible limbo of not knowing. As he outlined the Foundation's mission and programs, Thomas could feel Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in years. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as an ongoing influence, a light that continued to illuminate their path forward. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation will provide support for families of missing persons, resources for law enforcement, and awareness about the importance of cold case investigations, he explained. We've already established partnerships with forensic laboratories, law schools, and victim advocacy groups across the state. Emma joined him at the podium to announce the Foundation's first initiative, a grant program for small police departments to re-examine cold cases using advanced DNA technology. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers, she said, her voice strong and clear. Every cold file folder contains not just a victim, but a person who was loved, who is still missed, who deserves justice no matter how much time has passed. After the formal presentation, as attendees mingled and discussed ways to get involved, Detective Washington approached Thomas and Emma. Your mother would be so proud, she told Emma, her eyes bright with emotion. This is exactly the kind of legacy she deserves, one that helps others, that brings light to dark places. Thomas nodded in agreement. Sarah always believed that knowledge was the antidote to fear. That understanding could heal even the deepest wounds. This foundation embodies that belief. As the afternoon sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the garden, Thomas found himself standing alone by the fountain at the center of the memorial garden. The water sparkled in the golden light, creating rainbows that danced across the surface. Emma approached, slipping her arm through his. What are you thinking about, Dad? He smiled, looking at his daughter. So much her own person, yet carrying echoes of Sarah in her compassion, her determination, her belief in the power of truth. I was thinking about journeys, he said, about how we never could have imagined, back when we were searching for your mom, that her story would eventually help others find their way home. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. The worst thing that ever happened to us is now helping other people through their worst times. There's something beautiful about that, isn't there? Thomas nodded, watching as the last rays of sunlight illuminated the plaque bearing Sarah's name. Knowledge shared is love multiplied, he read softly. Mom would have liked that, Emma said. That her story didn't end in that reservoir, that it keeps going, keeps helping, keeps bringing truth to light. Together, they walked back toward the gathering, father and daughter, bound by loss but sustained by purpose, carrying forward the legacy of a woman whose life had been cut short but whose impact continued to grow, rippling outward like the waters of the fountain, touching lives far beyond their small Maryland town. The Sarah Mitchell case would eventually be cited in criminology textbooks, not just for its forensic significance, but for what it revealed about the enduring impact of unresolved cases on families and communities. The foundation that bore her name would go on to help solve dozens of cold cases across the country. bringing answers to families who had waited years, sometimes decades, for truth. And in Oakridge, a small library continued to welcome visitors with warmth and knowledge. Its garden a place of beauty and remembrance. Its director a living testament to the fact that even the deepest darkness cannot extinguish the light of love, of memory, of truth finally revealed. 5 years after the establishment of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, its impact had spread far beyond the boundaries of Oakridge, Maryland. What had begun as a local initiative had grown into a nationally recognized organization dedicated to solving cold cases and supporting the families of missing persons. The Foundation's headquarters remained in Oakridge, housed in a renovated historic building just down the street from the library where Sarah had once worked. On a bright spring morning, Emma Mitchell Collins stood at the window of her office, watching as a group of law enforcement officers filed into the Foundation's training center across the courtyard. Today marked the beginning of their newest program, a 2-week intensive course on advanced forensic techniques specifically designed for detectives working cold cases. At 42, Emma had grown into her role as the Foundation's executive director with the same quiet determination that had characterized her life since her mother's disappearance. Marriage to David Collins, now the chair of library sciences at the State University, had brought her a happiness she once thought impossible. Their 3-year-old daughter, named Sarah after the grandmother she would never meet, had further healed something in Emma's heart that she had feared would remain broken forever. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Thomas Mitchell entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. At 72, he had fully embraced his role as the Foundation's public face, speaking at conferences, meeting with lawmakers, and sharing Sarah's story to advocate for better resources for cold case investigations. "Ready for the big day?" he asked, handing her a cup. Emma nodded, taking a sip. 25 officers from 12 states, our biggest training class yet. "Your mother would be amazed at what you've built," Thomas said, pride evident in his voice. Before Emma could respond, her assistant appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Mitchell Collins, Detective Washington is here with the guest speaker." Layla Washington had officially retired from the police force 3 years earlier, but had immediately joined the Foundation as Director of Law Enforcement Relations. Her extensive network and decades of experience had proven invaluable as they worked to build credibility within the law enforcement community. She entered now with a woman Emma didn't recognize, tall and serious-looking, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Emma Thomas," Washington said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Special Agent Catherine Reeves from the FBI's Cold Case Initiative. She's our guest lecturer for the DNA genealogy portion of the training." As they exchanged greetings, Emma noticed something familiar in Reeves's intense gaze. "Have we met before?" she asked. Reeves shook her head. "No, but I'm very familiar with your mother's case. In fact, it's what inspired me to specialize in cold cases." She explained that as a young agent 20 years earlier, she'd been assigned to review unsolved disappearances along the eastern seaboard. "The Mitchell case stayed with me. The unanswered questions, the family's unwavering determination to find the truth. When Sarah's car was finally discovered, I followed the investigation closely, though I wasn't directly involved. Agent Reeves has been pioneering the use of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases," Washington added. "Her team has cleared over 30 cases in the past 3 years alone." As they walked together toward the training center, Reeves described her work, using DNA samples from crime scenes to build family trees through distant relatives who had submitted their DNA to genealogy databases, gradually narrowing down potential suspects until a match was found. "It's revolutionizing cold case work," she explained. "Cases that have been stalled for decades are suddenly solvable. People who thought they got away with murder are finding out that DNA can reach back through time." The training session opened with Thomas sharing Sarah's story, something he had done countless times, yet still managed to convey with raw emotion and purpose. He described not just the pain of losing Sarah, but the torment of not knowing what had happened to her for 17 years. Every holiday, every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday, we lived with a question mark where certainty should have been, he told the assembled officers. That's the reality for thousands of families across this country right now. They're stuck in limbo, unable to fully grieve, unable to move forward. Emma followed with a presentation on the Foundation's resources, grants for DNA testing, access to specialized forensic consultants, a network of volunteer researchers who helped organize and digitize old case files. "We're not here to tell you how to do your jobs," she assured the officers. "We're here to provide tools and support that might not be available within your department's budget or resources." As the day progressed, Emma found herself increasingly impressed by Agent Reeves's presentation. She spoke with the clarity of someone who truly understood both the science and the human element of cold case work. During a break, Emma approached her. "Would you be interested in joining us for dinner tonight? We often host our guest speakers, and I'd love to hear more about your work." Reeves seemed surprised but pleased by the invitation. "I'd be honored." That evening, in the comfortable dining room of Thomas's home, the conversation flowed easily. Washington had joined them, along with David and little Sarah, who charmed everyone before being whisked off to bed by a babysitter. Over dessert, Reeves revealed something she hadn't mentioned earlier. "There's another reason your mother's case has special significance for me," she said, setting down her coffee cup. "My own mother disappeared when I was 12. Her case was never solved." A hush fell over the table. Emma felt a jolt of recognition. The look she had noticed in Reeves's eyes earlier was one she had seen in her own mirror for years. The look of someone living with an unanswered question. "I'm so sorry," Thomas said quietly. Reeves nodded in acknowledgement. It was 1982. She went to the grocery store one evening and never came home. Her car was found in the parking lot, but there was no sign of her. No witnesses, no evidence of what happened. "Have you used your genetic genealogy techniques to investigate?" Washington asked gently. "I've tried," Reeves admitted. "But without a crime scene, without DNA evidence of any kind, there's little to work with. The case has gone colder with each passing year." As she spoke, Emma was struck by the parallel journeys they had traveled. Both daughters marked by a mother's unexplained absence, both drawn to work that might provide others with the answers they sought for themselves. "That's why what you're doing here matters so much," Reeves continued, gesturing around her. "Not every case can be solved, but every family deserves to know that someone is still looking, still caring, still remembering the person they lost." Later that night, after their guests had departed, Emma sat with her father in the quiet living room. "Did you know about Agent Reeves's mother?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, but it explains her dedication. She understands what it means to live with uncertainty." "It's strange," Emma said thoughtfully. "When Mom first disappeared, I felt so alone, like no one could possibly understand what we were going through. Now I realize there are thousands of people living with the same questions, the same open wounds." Thomas reached over to squeeze her hand. "And that's why the Foundation matters. We're creating a community for people who never asked to be part of one." The training program continued over the next 2 weeks, with officers learning about the latest advances in forensic technology, investigative techniques, and victim advocacy. Emma found herself increasingly drawn to Agent Reeves, recognizing in her a kindred spirit. On the final day, as certificates were being presented, Emma's assistant hurried into the room, whispering urgently in her ear. Emma's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Is everything all right?" Thomas asked as she returned to his side. "That was the lab in Virginia," she said, her voice unsteady. "They've identified a DNA match in one of the cases we funded testing for last year. The Martin case from Pittsburgh, the teenage girl who disappeared in 1987. Washington, overhearing, joined them. After 37 years? That's remarkable." The news spread quickly through the room. For the officers who had spent 2 weeks immersed in cold case methodology, this real-time breakthrough was the perfect conclusion to their training. Agent Reeves approached, her expression serious. "Which lab processed the sample?" "Grayson Forensics in Richmond," Emma replied. Reeves nodded. "They're excellent. I've worked with them before." She hesitated, then added, "I have some contacts in the Pittsburgh field office. If the local department needs federal support with the arrest, I could help facilitate that." Within hours, a flurry of activity had transformed the Foundation's quiet offices into a command center of sorts. The detective from Pittsburgh, who had submitted the DNA sample, was on a video call, reviewing the results with the lab technicians. Agent Reeves was on her phone, coordinating with FBI colleagues. Washington was pulling together resources the local department might need for a case about to suddenly reactivate after nearly 4 decades. Emma watched it all unfold with a mixture of excitement and solemnity. This was exactly what the Foundation had been created to do, to bridge gaps between departments, to provide resources, to keep old cases from being forgotten. And now, somewhere in Pittsburgh, a family was about to receive the phone call they had been waiting for since 1987. "It never gets old, does it?" Thomas said, coming to stand beside her. "That moment when a case breaks open." Emma shook her head. "Never." By evening, news had come that an arrest had been made, a 71-year-old man now living in Florida. Identified through DNA, he had unwittingly left at the scene decades earlier. Matched through a second cousin who had submitted to a genealogy website. As the training participants gathered for their closing dinner, there was a palpable sense of purpose in the room. What had begun as theoretical learning had culminated in a real-world result. A family would now have answers, a killer would face justice, a victim would be remembered. Thomas raised his glass in a toast. To the Martin family, who never gave up hope. To Detective Sanchez, who never gave up searching, and to all of you, who carry the sacred trust of speaking for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Manita Kasaid Sisti Sunday. The following morning, as the officers departed for their home jurisdictions, Agent Reeves lingered behind. She found Emma in the memorial garden behind the Foundation building, sitting on a bench near the fountain that bore Sarah's name. "I wanted to thank you," Reeves said, joining her. "Not just for hosting the training, but for what you've created here. This foundation, it's making a difference in ways you might not even realize." Emma smiled. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth." Reeves paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "I've been thinking about my mother's case, about how little physical evidence exists, about how unlikely it is that traditional forensic approaches will ever solve it." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder. "These are my mother's case files, what's left of them anyway. I was wondering if your research team might look at them with fresh eyes. Sometimes an outside perspective sees patterns that are invisible to those too close to the case." Emma accepted the folder, understanding the trust this represented. "We'd be honored to review them." "There's something else," Reeves added hesitantly. "The Foundation's victim support network, the counseling services, the peer connections. I've never participated in anything like that. I've always kept my personal connection to my work private. But watching how you've transformed your own loss into a source of healing for others, it's made me reconsider that approach." Emma nodded, recognizing the difficulty of this admission for someone as self-contained as Reeves. "The support groups meet on Thursday evenings. You'd be welcome any time." As they walked back toward the main building, Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Foundation had already accomplished so much. Dozens of cases solved, hundreds of families supported, thousands of law enforcement officers trained. Yet each new connection, each shared story, reminded her that the work was far from finished. In her office, she found Thomas reviewing applications for their next round of grants. "Agent Reeves is heading back to Quantico?" he asked, looking up. Emma nodded, placing the folder of case files on her desk. "She asked if our research team would look into her mother's disappearance." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "That's a significant step for her." I think this week has been transformative for her in some ways, seeing how we've channeled our experience with Mom into something positive. Your mother would be so proud of you, Thomas said, not for the first time, of how you've carried her legacy forward. Emma smiled, glancing at the photo of Sarah that still held a place of honor on her desk. I used to wonder what she would think of all this, the foundation, the work we do. Now I feel like I know. She was a librarian because she believed in helping people find answers. In a way, we're continuing that mission, just in a different form. That evening, Emma arrived home to find David and little Sarah in the backyard, planting flowers in a small garden they had created together. Her daughter looked up, face smudged with dirt, eyes bright with excitement. "Mommy, we're planting cosmos. Daddy says they'll grow as tall as me." Emma knelt beside her, breathing in the scent of fresh soil and spring flowers. "They're beautiful, sweetheart. What colors did you choose?" "Pink and purple and white," Sarah declared proudly. "Like the ones in Grandpa's garden." Emma exchanged a smile with David over their daughter's head. The garden at Thomas's home had been planted in memory of the first Sarah, filled with flowers she had loved. Now this new Sarah was creating her own connection to the grandmother she knew only through stories and photographs. Later, after their daughter was asleep, Emma and David sat on the porch swing, enjoying the mild evening air. She told him about the breakthrough in the Martin case, about Agent Reeves's request for help with her mother's disappearance. "It never ends, does it?" David observed. "One case solved leads to another that needs attention." Emma nodded. "Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever reach a point where we feel like we've done enough." David considered this. Maybe that's not the right measure. Maybe it's not about reaching some final goal, but about continuing to make a difference, one family at a time. He was right, Emma realized. The work of the foundation wasn't something that could ever truly be completed. As long as there were unsolved cases, as long as there were families living with unanswered questions, there would be a need for what they offered: resources, support, and most importantly, the assurance that their missing loved ones had not been forgotten. The next morning, Emma arrived at the foundation early. The building was quiet, the training center empty, now that the officers had returned to their home jurisdictions. She made her way to the memorial wall in the main lobby, where photographs of solved cases were displayed, alongside notes of gratitude from families who had finally received answers. Among them was a picture of Sarah, not the formal portrait from her library ID that had appeared in newspapers during the search, but a candid shot taken at Emma's 9th birthday party. Sarah was laughing, her eyes crinkled with joy as she helped Emma blow out the candles on her cake. It was how Emma preferred to remember her mother, vibrant, loving, fully present in a moment of ordinary happiness. Beside the photo hung the framed letter Sarah had written for Emma's 10th birthday, the one recovered from Calloway's property. Its message of love and encouragement had become something of a mission statement for the foundation. As Emma stood there, she heard the main door open behind her. Turning, she saw Detective Washington entering, accompanied by a middle-aged couple she didn't recognize. The woman's eyes were red-rimmed, her husband's face set in lines of barely contained emotion. "Emma," Washington said gently, "this is Michael and Janet Owens. Their daughter Melissa disappeared in 1999. She was a college student at Maryland State." Emma stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm very sorry about your daughter," she said, the words familiar yet always heartfelt. Janet Owens nodded, her gaze moving to the wall of photographs. "Detective Washington says you might be able to help us, that your foundation sometimes looks into cases the police have had to set aside." "We'd like to tell you about Melissa," Michael added, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "She was studying to be a teacher. She loved children, volunteered at a literacy program. She was only 19 when she disappeared." Emma felt the familiar tug of connection. Another family caught in the same terrible limbo she and Thomas had endured for 17 years. Another young woman whose story remained unfinished. Another mystery waiting for answers. "Come into my office," she said warmly. "Tell me everything about Melissa. Every detail you can remember, no matter how small it might seem." As she led them through the Foundation's headquarters, Emma felt a profound sense of purpose. This was why she got up every morning. This was why the Foundation existed. Not just to honor Sarah's memory, but to ensure that every missing person was remembered, that every family knew they were not alone in their search for truth. In her office, Emma took out a fresh notebook and wrote Melissa Owens's name at the top of the first page. "Start from the beginning," she encouraged the Owens family. "Tell me about the day Melissa disappeared." As they began to speak, Emma listened with the deep attention of someone who truly understood what they were going through. She knew the pain behind every detail they shared, recognized the mixture of hope and fear that had sustained them for 24 years of uncertainty. And she knew with absolute conviction that this was exactly where she was meant to be, carrying forward the legacy of a mother whose disappearance had shaped her life, whose discovery had transformed her understanding of justice, and whose love continued to guide her work of bringing light to the darkest of human mysteries. In the quiet space of her office, as a new case unfolded before her, Emma felt her mother's presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a continuing influence, a light that illuminated the path for those still searching in the dark. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.